In today's video, we're going to be talking about a very unique training technique called eccentric quasi-isometrics and how you can apply it in your mobility training in order to eccentrically overload the tissues at their end range of motion. Now, if you don't have equipment, it can be a little difficult in order to overload tissues because it's very easy to do it when you have a strong enough external load. Now, if you want to utilize a very strong and high intensity, high effort eccentric contraction, you have to learn how to manipulate leverage. And I'm going to use the figure 4 as an example, along with the 90-90 after. But we're going to try and talk about how to utilize leverage and how to manipulate position in order to maximize intensity and take advantage of the very unique benefits that eccentrics provide for the body. So for this figure 4 variation, I'm going to go over how you can apply an eccentric quasi-isometric for end range hip flexion in a knee extended position. So we're actually working your two joint hip flexor, your rectus femoris, that crosses the hip joint and the knee joint. And so you're going to notice a very strong contraction in the regressive tissue here, primarily right in the middle of your thigh. You might even feel it high up in the hip flexor or your one joint hip flexor as well. Now for here, you're just going to go to your end range, and then you're going to back off a little bit. And the reason is we want to start the motion off with a passive range lift off. So from here, you're going to lift off about a millimeter off the floor into your end range. Now your goal is to maintain this distance as long as possible or as hard as possible. And when you start to fail, you slowly fail under control. And the way you do that is you simply back off and come out of hip flexion until you can relock that knee, maintain dorsiflexion, flex, 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 until you fail, and then you slowly back off, and then you go for whatever time that you set for that particular rep. Now, in order to fully take advantage of eccentrics, there has to be an overload component to it. And so what that means is we have to try and fight against a load that's heavier than we can actually tolerate or handle. But in terms of eccentric quasi-isometrics, we're trying to fail under control. And so in order to do that, we can only come out of position just enough to continue to feel like we're working at our hardest intensity. Because intention here is very, very important, and your effort is going to dictate how well you take advantage of that eccentric. So if I'm lifting off and I feel like I'm failing, but then I back off a bunch and I feel I can hold this for about 2 minutes, then I'm probably not working hard enough, which means I'm not really loading the tissue to their fullest capacity. And so in order to take care or take advantage of that eccentric, you have to slowly do it, but only go into that eccentric or only create that lengthening by way of failure. But your goal here is to do it under control. So that's an example of how you do it in figure 4 for hip flexion. You can also do it for 90-90 or hip internal rotation. Now this one's a little bit more gnarly. So if we're here at end range internal rotation of the hip, of the trail leg in 90-90, I shouldn't be able to create any lift off, right? But if I want to back off a little bit and rotate forward, I should be able to create enough of a lift off from the ground to feel like I'm at end range and I'm really fighting with my hip internal rotators. Now, because the ground is blocking me from going into external rotation, I'm not going to let my foot drop. Instead, I'm going to let my torso lean forward. And as I do that, it's going to allow myself or my body to hold this internal rotation much easier. So this is how we manipulate leverage to make it easier for the joint. And making sure that we maintain just a millimeter of space here on the ground and very strict posture through the torso, through the pelvis, that's how we're going to ensure that we're working hard enough. Because remember, the intention of feeling like you're trying hardest for the allotted time is probably the most important thing, okay? So in this example, I'm going to get nice and upright. I'm going to stay tight. I'm going to irradiate, and I'm going to create a lift off. Right now, I'm barely lifting off the floor, and I should feel a very, very strong contraction here. And as I start to fail, I lean forward. And when I feel like I can't hold that anymore, I lean forward a little more, and then a little bit more, and a little more. And same thing, if I'm doing this for 30 seconds, a minute, whatever the case may be, I should feel like I'm practically dying the whole time, okay? Use the floor as feedback. You don't want to touch it, but you want to create just enough space between your foot and the floor to know that you're trying your hardest to maintain that position. So that's how you apply, or those are two examples of how you apply eccentric quasi-isometrics. There are other examples, but I hope this is a very good introduction to the concept or the idea of failing under control. It's something that you can apply in your passive range holds for hip flexion, standing variations, or any passive range or regressive tissue end range variation of your mobility training or whatever else you're doing. So think about that, see how you can apply that in other positions, and then let me know what you think.